It's April 26, 1986, northern Ukraine in the Soviet Union. A massive explosion rocks a nuclear power plant called Chernobyl. The explosion is so powerful that it can be heard from miles away. A radioactive cloud begins to spread into the atmosphere. The radiation is so intense that it instantly kills the reactor's core and spreads contamination across an enormous area. By the next day, an entire city has to be evacuated. By the next week, the effects are being detected across Europe. By the end of the year, thousands of people are dead or dying from radiation poisoning. This is the Chernobyl disaster, and it's the worst nuclear accident in human history. Nothing before it came close. Nothing.
Sense has matched it, and the story of what went wrong is a story of arrogance, negligence, poor training, and the Soviet system's inability to admit mistakes. The Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant was built in the 1970s in northern Ukraine. It was supposed to be a symbol of Soviet technological achievement. The Soviet Union was proud of its nuclear program. They believed nuclear energy was the future. They believed they could build it safely. The reactor at Chernobyl was called the RBMK reactor, and it was a Soviet design. It was supposed to be one of the most advanced reactors in the world. The plant had 4 reactors, and they were generating electricity for millions of people across the Soviet Union. But the RBMK reactor had a fundamental design flaw. Unlike Western reactors, it didn't have a containment structure around it. If something went wrong, if the reactor failed, there was nothing to contain the radioactive material. It would just release into the atmosphere. Western nuclear engineers knew about this design flaw. They had warned against it. But the Soviet Union didn't listen. They were confident in their design. They believed their system was superior. The operators at Chernobyl were also undertrained. They didn't fully understand the reactor's behavior. They didn't fully understand the dangers they were dealing with. Safety protocols existed, but they weren't always followed. There was a culture of cutting corners, of ignoring safety procedures to maintain production. The Soviet system prioritized output over safety. Meeting quotas was more important than preventing accidents. On April 25, 1986, a test was scheduled at the Chernobyl plant. It was supposed to be a routine test to see how long the reactor could continue running on residual heat if there was a loss of external power. It was a legitimate test, but it was going to be conducted during the night shift when staffing was reduced. The night shift operators were less experienced than the day shift operators. The test was also going to be supervised by people who didn't have extensive experience with the reactor. As the test began, the operators started shutting down various safety systems. They did this deliberately, thinking it wouldn't be a problem. They reduced the power output of the reactor. Everything seemed to be going fine, but then something unexpected happened. The reactor's power output dropped lower than expected. The operators, worried about the test failing, made a decision to disable more safety systems to keep the reactor stable. At 1:23 in the morning, the test began its critical phase. The operators shut off the emergency cooling systems. The reactor was now running with virtually all of its safety systems disabled. This was catastrophically dangerous, but the operators didn't seem to fully understand what they were doing. They were focused on completing the test. The reactor's power output surged unexpectedly. The operators tried to shut down the reactor by inserting control rods, but something went horribly wrong. The control rods got stuck. The reactor didn't shut down. Instead, the power continued to surge. Within seconds, the reactor temperature soared to over 3,000 degrees Celsius. The fuel rods began to melt. The reactor was out of control. At 1:24 a.m., the reactor exploded. It was the most catastrophic explosion a reactor had ever experienced. The explosion blew the 200-ton lid off the reactor. It blew out through the roof of the building. The explosion released a massive amount of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The explosion was so powerful that it killed 2 workers instantly. It would kill dozens more within the coming days and weeks from radiation exposure. Soviet authorities initially tried to cover it up. They didn't immediately evacuate a surrounding area. They didn't immediately warn the population. People in the nearby city of Pripyat had no idea what had happened. But within hours, radiation detectors across the Soviet Union and Europe were picking up.
Radioactive cloud. The Soviet Union couldn't hide it anymore. They had to admit something had happened. By the next day, the city of Pripyat was evacuated. 50,000 people had to leave their homes. They thought they were leaving for a few days. Most of them never went back. The city became a ghost town. Apartment buildings were left exact
as they were. Children's toys were left on the floor. Families' possessions were abandoned. Today, Pripyat is still abandoned. It's become a symbol of the disaster. But Pripyat was just the beginning. The radioactive cloud spread across the Soviet Union and then across Europe. Within a few days, radiation was detected in Scandinavia, Germany, and Britain. Milk in European countries became contaminated with radioactive iodine. The contamination spread across an enormous area. Hundreds of thousands of people were exposed to radiation. The long-term health effects would be catastrophic. Within weeks, emergency workers, called liquidators, were sent into the reactor to contain the disaster. These were soldiers and workers who knew they were being sent into an extremely radioactive environment. They were told to clear debris and stabilize the reactor. Many of them received lethal doses of radiation. Estimates suggest that between 4,000 and 6,000 emergency workers died as a direct result of their exposure. Many of the rest suffered health problems for the rest of their lives. The immediate death toll from the explosion and acute radiation sickness was officially counted as 31. 2 workers died in the explosion. 29 emergency workers died from radiation exposure. But these official numbers are almost certainly too low. The Soviet Union had no incentive to report accurate numbers. Many deaths were attributed to other causes. The actual death toll from immediate radiation exposure was probably several hundred at least. But the long-term health effects were far worse. The contamination spread across an enormous area. Millions of people were exposed to radiation. Cancer rates, especially thyroid cancer in children, skyrocketed. Leukemia rates increased. Birth defects increased. The radiation would be affecting people's health for decades. Some estimates suggest that the eventual death toll from cancer caused by Chernobyl radiation exposure could be in the tens of thousands. What made Chernobyl so catastrophic was a combination of factors. The reactor had a fundamental design flaw. The operators were undertrained. Safety systems were disabled. There was no containment structure. And the Soviet system's culture of secrecy meant that warnings and information weren't shared openly. If just one of these factors had been different, the disaster might not have happened. The Soviet Union's initial response to the disaster was typical of a system built on secrecy and control. They tried to cover it up. They minimized the danger. They didn't share information with neighboring countries. When other countries detected the radiation and asked what had happened, the Soviet Union was evasive. This lack of openness meant that people in neighboring countries weren't warned in time to take protective measures. If there had been transparency, more people could have been protected. Chernobyl changed nuclear policy around the world. Countries began reevaluating their nuclear safety standards. Reactor designs were examined more carefully. The RBMK design was never used anywhere else. Chernobyl became the standard example of what could go wrong with nuclear power if safety wasn't prioritized. The disaster didn't eliminate nuclear power, but it made the world more cautious about it. The exclusion zone around Chernobyl is still there. An area roughly 20 miles in radius around the reactor is still restricted. It's too radioactive for people to live there. The radiation will take thousands years to decay to safe levels. The reactor itself is now entombed in a massive concrete structure called the sarcophagus, and later a secondary containment structure was built around it to prevent further contamination.
Pripyat remains abandoned. It's become a place that tourists visit to see what a nuclear disaster looks like. They walk through the empty schools where children never came back. They see the apartments where families never returned. They see the amusement park that was supposed to open on May 1st, but never did. It's a haunting reminder of what happened. It's a reminder of the consequences of prioritizing profit and production over safety. It's a reminder that technological systems can fail, and when they do,